Thank you. The only fault I found with that introduction was, and I told him, don't worry about being too effusive, just go right ahead. Sometimes I'm very modest about introduction. I say, you don't have to go overboard, very complicated, just something simple like, not since Mark Twain. So, and I'm not here to boast, but the only fault I found with the introduction is that he didn't mention that Tepper Isn't Going Out is the first parking novel ever written. I regret to say there hasn't been a bandwagon of people trying to write parking novels since then. I thought I'd talk tonight since Dogfight is a sort of result of what we call deadline poetry. Talk about being a deadline poet. Some years ago, in an Authors Guild benefit, Garrison Keillor organized a program in which 4 or 5 authors rejected famous works of literature. Garrison himself rejected Walden Pond by Henry David Thoreau. He said there were a lot of good axioms in it, but the structure was weak, and he suggested making it into a calendar. I rejected The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. I did it in iambic pentameter, of course, and the last couplet was, I know this is a blow, Tom, not to worry. You're still the greatest poet from Missouri. How faint that praise is can be judged by the fact that the other poet from Missouri is me. And sometimes I say that T.S. Eliot and I are the Missouri School of Poetry. We do have differences. I'm from Kansas City, which during my entire childhood was known as the gateway to the West. And he was from St. Louis, which got the government to build it a big gateway arch and started calling itself the Gateway to the West. I didn't really blame them. Before that, they were known as Mound City, which always drew the question, mound of what? So you can't blame them, really. Although we don't think of it as the Gateway to the West, we think of St. Louis as the exit from the East. And there's some similarities between T.S. Eliot and me. We both use foreign language in our poetry. He tends to use Sanskrit. I don't use much Sanskrit. I don't actually know much Sanskrit. I was one of those kids who got kind of dreamy during Sanskrit class in Kansas City, sort of look out the window. I use Yiddish some. I think it's fair to say that T.S. Eliot was not partial to Yiddish. My shortest poem uses Yiddish. My shortest poem was called something like The Societal, Political, and Philosophical Implications of the O.J. Simpson Trial. The title doesn't count in the length. And the poem was, O.J., oy vey. And also when Yugoslavia started to break up, I did a poem that said, Croatians are the good guys now, although their past is somewhat shady, so worry not that these same guys chased both your Bubby and your Zadie. We both used a little German. When George W. Bush appointed an old family retainer to be Attorney General, I did a poem that rhymed Alberto Gonzalez with loyal über alles. We both write about animals sometime. He famously wrote a lot of things about cats. My daughter said once at the dinner table when somebody brought up cats, "Daddy hates cats." And I said, "Daddy does not hate cats. That would be prejudice. And you girls have been brought up to abhor prejudice. Daddy has never met a cat that he liked." And I've written about corgis. I wrote in a column once that corgis look like a breed of dog that had been assembled from the parts of other breeds of dogs, and not the parts that those other breeds were all that sorry about giving up. I'll admit there's never been a Broadway show called Corgis. I'm a second-generation poet. I don't know about Eliot. My father was a grocer for most of his working life, but he had a restaurant for a few years, and he took advantage of that to write a couplet on the menu at lunch every day, mostly about pie. Not P-I pie, P-I-E pie. I had a lot of trouble with pi when I was in high school. Math was my worst subject. I was never able to persuade the mathematics teacher that many of my answers were meant ironically. And you may remember at one point the Texas State Legislature passed a resolution in favor of changing pi to an even 3. And I was for it. I thought it was a good idea. Restaurant proprietor poetry is unusual. You don't really find many restaurant proprietors writing poetry. Although they're good with mottos. Remember the motto of the Burger King in Paris, Maison du Whopper. And in Owensboro, Kentucky, where, as most of you probably know, Owensboro is the barbecue mutton capital of the world. One restaurant has a sign that says, "Mary had a little lamb, won't you have some too?" But there aren't many occupational group genres of poetry. The only one I know for sure is cowboy poetry, which is odd because cowboys are thought to be laconic and suspicious of book learning. But there are probably more cowboy poets now than there are cowboys. I actually met one of them, Baxter Black. He's a famous cowboy poet. He wrote a book called Croutons on a Cow Pie. But I've thought occasionally of what it would be like if other occupational groups had poetry. I mean, William Carlos Williams was a doctor and a poet, but he didn't write doctor poetry. Doctor poetry, if it followed the pattern of cowboy poetry, cowboy poets don't think much about meter. They have about as much use for meter as they would have for, say, an English saddle or something like that. And they're easily inspired. They're the most easily inspired poets. I mean,